Good afternoon, everybody. We've reached the last leg of the conference, so congratulations to you all for staying the course. It's great that you're all still with us. So just to say, there's two parts to this last leg. Firstly, and Paul will introduce in a moment, our final keynote speaker, George Wright, and then immediately after that, we will have the closing ceremony. So could I please encourage you to stay for that ceremony, because that will be an opportunity for us to congratulate the best students for their presentations. I think there'll be some other awards, and also, of course, you'll learn about next year's ISF, which is in Charlottesville. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand over now to Paul Goodwin, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you very much, John. Well, it's a pleasure to welcome and introduce today's keynote speaker, Professor George Wright of Strathclyde University. George is the founding editor-in-chief, in fact, of the Journal of Behavioural Decision Making, and also founding editor of a more recent journal, Futures and Foresight Science, which has, I think, great relevance to the topic he's talking about today. George has authored and edited several books and countless papers. He's got nearly 20,000 citations on Google Scholar, so he's very well cited. He's particularly well known, I think, for three main things, although he'll correct me if I've missed any out. Subjective probability. He did a lot of work in calibration of probabilities several years ago. The Delphi method, a paper he wrote with Gene Wright, is incredibly widely cited, a paper about the Delphi method. And more recently, or maybe not quite so recently now, he's got involved with scenario planning, which of course is the topic of today's talk. And in the context of scenario planning, George has actually been named as the world's most productive and cited researcher in the area of scenario planning. And he's also carried out many consultancy roles with a wide range of organizations, public organizations like the government and private organizations. So not only has he researched the topic, he's got widespread experience in applying it. So would you please welcome George Wright.
Cool. Can you all hear me? Is that? No? If I sit then maybe more nearer this microphone. I thought this microphone here would work, but maybe it doesn't. Is it working now? Is it? Okay. Okay. So thanks very much indeed, Paul, for that very special introduction. So I've worked with Paul, as many of you know, for quite a while as well, in terms of producing a lot of papers, in fact, linked to scenarios and using decision analysis techniques. We've also, I think the side writer on a paper that Paul wrote, really, which is to do with adjustments to time series models as well. So the paper that I'm going to talk about today, the one thing I'm going to talk about today, brings together all these areas, because I think the areas are fairly separate, to try and bring a sort of reconciliation of them. That's the subjective probability forecasting. And in the early days, the forecasting wasn't forecasting. In fact, it was people made assessments of which is longer, the Suez Canal or Panama Canal, and chose one of those, which they didn't know quite what the answer was, and put a probability or a confidence to that. And calibration was measured from those sort of beginnings. And in fact, one or two of the early papers I was involved with actually tried to see if it was different in the forecasting area. If you did longer-term forecasts or personal events, because the measurement of outcome validity wasn't so easy, because you couldn't, you knew the answer to the almanac question, which is longer Suez Canal or Panama. You as the experimenter could mark it very easly, but once you get into forecasting, you've got to wait for the events, the time to pass, and then you can make an evaluation. Initial work I did was with that. And then also looking at Delphi, which is another method, a judgmental method for looking into the future, with Gene Rowe and Fergus Bolger here. We looked at, how you could improve the Delphi method. And finally, in scenarios, I worked with Kees van der Heijden, who was the ex-head of internal consultancy, in fact, the head of scenario planning at the Shell organization. He came to Strathclyde in the early 90s, and I went to some of his lectures on advanced strategic management, and I found out a lot about scenarios, which is a practitioner-based tool. But I, being trained in decision analysis at that point, could also see what the benefits were as well. So again, I got involved with that. So this talk then is really about the intersection, I think, of those three sorts of areas: judgmental probability forecasting, judgmental adjustments of time series, Delphi, and also these scenarios. And I think there's a way of putting these methods together for anticipating the future. And we'll talk about those sorts of things as we work through. So I've got a set of slides. They'll take me some time to get through. Hopefully it's going to be interesting as we go through, and those of you who know something about subjective probability forecasting or Delphi or judgmental adjustments to time series or scenarios will begin to see how these things can fit together. So I'm going to give a general background on these methods to start with, and talk a little bit about them. Then I'll talk about the intuitive logic scenario method, which is the most widely used method, in fact the one that came from Shell. I'll then talk about the ubiquity of, very difficult to point this, of narrative thinking and anticipating the future. In fact, we all tend to think in terms of narratives when we're anticipating the future. And there's a lot of psychological research to show that's really how we do, that's how we think about anticipation. I'll then talk about use of scenarios in the forecasting practice, how they're being used recently in energy forecasting, and then use of scenarios in the judgmental forecasting research laboratory. And we'll see that things are quite different. And then I'll raise some issues and concerns that come forward. So general background to start with. The first is that the extant empirical research on judgmental forecasting, it's easy if maybe I can I don't know if I can bring up a pointer. Judgmental forecasting, it's got probability forecasting roots in decision theory, decision analysis. So when I trained as a decision analyst, probabilities went into the decision trees, and they were often subjective probabilities because they were for unique events. And that's why I was interested initially in subjective probabilities, because they were a component of decision analysis. And if you're doing decision analysis, you had to elicit subjective probabilities from decision makers. And they were not like the weather forecasters, where it's a repetitive task with feedback, etc. These were very judgmental assessments. That's where it sort of came from. And time series adjustments, I think the roots of this is observations of forecasting practice. People tend to want to intervene and make adjustments in practice. And many of the research issues are to do with these adjustments are sensible or not. The Delphi method, which is a group-based method rather than an individual method, is again focused on individual judgments but aggregating them. It's got roots in the Cold War and forecasting the impact of technology. So you're getting a group of individuals together. In the Delphi method, people make individual assessments about, say, the likelihood of something happening or when it will happen or what a quantity will be. They then listen to what other people say, perhaps with rationales attached, this is the important thing, and then can, without losing face, adjust their own initial assessment to take into account what other people have said, if they think what the other people have said is sensible. Maybe they've just got a descriptive statistics of whether the median or the range of assessments other people have made are different from them, and they can make some adjustments. So it's a group-based method in the sense that it's groups are having an input of information into the individual. So those are methods are running on probably side by side with a little bit of interaction between them. Then scenario thinking is very much more on, it's a process, group-based process in practice. It's come from practice, it's come mainly from the Shell organization in many ways, this intuitive logics method. It's practitioner-based, so there are many approaches. There isn't a normative approach like decision analysis. So different practitioners do different things. But it's very appealing to senior managers, perhaps in the UK, who are not so quantitatively orientated. And they believe, this is why they pay money for this, is that their intuitions are improved and enhanced and at a higher level by going through a scenario exercise. So there's no outcome data really, it's really very attitudinal. Okay, so that's what the background is. And the issue I'm concerned with is this idea of rationales, people's underpinning rationales. And some of the talks I've been to over the last few days, judgments are made, but the rationales, perhaps there's no real focus on them. The logics, the rationales that people have for an assessment. And the judgmental forecasting, it's mostly focused on the research that's been done on contextual effects, personal, impersonal, short-term, long-term, time series, with or without context. And people looking for amount of bias in the judgmental assessments and the degree to which the bias is, less or more, or what can cause, what's the experimental manipulation that changes the amount of bias, perhaps. Well, Delphi, the research that's been done, so there's very little focus on rationales, really, in the judgmental forecasting literature, not very much. Judgmental forecasting with Delphi, individuals, the focus can be, at least, on rationales, people exchanging their rationales, and people revising their opinion as they hear a better rationale or a good rationale, with identifying arguments perhaps they hadn't thought of before. So that's how opinion changes in Delphi. It doesn't converge, it maybe converges on an answer, perhaps it's more likely to be correct. And the early research that had an output-based focus did focus on that and show that Delphi can improve judgments. Scenario thinking, it's very much, as we'll see in a few minutes' time, on rationality and causality, not rationality, causality within these rationales. It's the causes, not people saying Martians will land from outer space. It's saying why things may lead on, how one thing will lead to another. However takes over the Conservative Party will lead to less or more taxes, or less or more spending on the armed forces, or, less, et cetera, et cetera. You can work out a sort of logic going forward. And so in the judgmental forecasting area, the focus has really been on bias, extent of bias, and sometimes there's been feedback to assessors after repetitive forecasts, so people can see that they are overconfident maybe, and therefore maybe there can be an adjustment in the distribution of responses maybe. We'll talk about that in a few minutes' time. Delphi, structured group-based challenge of individual judgments by this opinions of others being brought in, but it's done in a way that people aren't threatened, people can change their opinion without losing face. If you think, I've got it wrong, you don't need to say that, you can just change your opinion, it's all anonymous, etc. Scenario thinking, much more informal, group-based. It's just a group interacting. There's no structure to it, as with Delphi, but it is a group-based. But there is challenge to individual judgments, but not necessarily structured, except by a facilitator of the process. So, difference in focus, really. Judgmental forecasting, very much more quantitative, a single event or a single value. Judgment, subjective probability assessment, or time series adjustment focused. Point estimates then, mostly short term, because that's where you got the outcome data, of course. You can make some evaluations of overconfidence, and outcome verification is possible and often a focus. Scenario thinking then, more qualitative, you're building many scenarios of the future. I'll show that in a few seconds' time. Broad brush focus on causality. That's really what it's about, this causality. It's about narratives, stories of the way the future might be, very much longer term, 10 to 15 years, and outcome verification is left unaddressed, usually. Because, it's a scenario, it could happen, as we'll talk about in a few minutes' time, may not happen. As a probability, as an intersection of events, it has an infinitesimal likelihood of occurrence. But the method itself can produce quite a lot of positive outcomes, as I'll show you in a second. Okay, so let me talk you through a scenario method, this main method, the scenario method, the intuitive logics method, the one that came from Shell. I'll talk about the components, and you'll see how it all fits together. Remember, it's practitioner-based. There's no sort of normative logic to it, but it works. As I say, it's a group-based activity. Very difficult to use this thing here. It's utilizing individual judgments. And the judgment's really about what the issue of concern is, which is where the scenarios will be built, and identification of what we call driving forces, or from the Pestel dimension. So the scenarios are all usually about the external environment to an organization. It's what will happen politically, socially, economically, technologically, politically, in legal terms and regulation terms, all the changes that are in this broad contextual environment. It will shape the world within which the organization perhaps will thrive or survive or perhaps decline. So scenarios are very much about a broad picture view of the world. And the driving forces then are political driving forces, technological driving forces, and that's where the Pestel comes from. It's actually a bit more sophisticated, but that's mainly it. Most of them are uncertainties. So it'd be level of, economic growth, level of, extent of, degree of, because most of the future, of course, is uncertain. But some things will be more certain, perhaps like demographics. We know that into the future in the pipeline is an aging population in most of Europe, for instance. When you do this, you take off duplicate driving forces. And the reason you do that is because you want to segregate out the 100 or 200 driving forces you develop from a group into small clusters of interrelated driving forces. And so by taking off duplicates, it means the clusters you separate out are artificially separate. You haven't got one driving force that's in several clusters. And then we tend to rate the clusters in terms of impact and uncertainty and identify the major bases of the scenarios and then develop these narratives or scenario storylines. Let me give you an example then. So here is one driving force, might be a political one, having an impact on another one. And it's earlier in time because it starts the arrow, it's a time precedence, and it has a causal impact on what follows, has an effect. So that's how these clusters of driving forces are formed. And here is a cluster of driving forces. So this is outcome of the next UK general election, would lead on to rate of corporation tax, again it's an uncertainty, rate of personal taxation, level of UK government borrowing, which perhaps would lead on to degree of spend on National Health Service, or because of, depending on the level of borrowing, the level of personal taxation, level of corporation tax. If that's a priority, then the amount of money that's available to spend on infrastructure projects or perhaps on the armed forces. So you think through this intuitive logic, which is from the heads or of the decision makers. And you build then clusters of interrelated driving forces that go across. In this case, this is a political driving force, that's a financial driving force, and you get these coming out. So you'd be simplifying the 100 or 200 driving forces you identify from a group that they say is important in impacting the viability maybe of a firm, and you start to think it through in terms of clusters. And the clusters then, cluster headings, and that would be political priorities, that one there, you then put on an impact predictability matrix where the impact will be high or low on the issue of concern, which might be the viability of a firm, and then say what's going on in the cluster. Is it low predictability of the outcomes of a cluster? Do we not know what's going to happen? It could happen many several ways, like the Conservatives could win the next election, Labour could win, hung Parliament, etc. Or is it fairly predetermined, like up here? We know what's going to happen. There's only really one outcome from a cluster. Okay. Now this, of course, you could think, well, maybe relates to probability, but in fact, it's more linked to plausibility and Shackle's idea of surprise. I don't want to again go into it, but there's a sort of an axiom base now to decision analysis in the link to Shackle's older view of a different way of making decisions. Okay, this is how it's done. It's done by people in rooms with soft drinks mainly. Here you can see them. Thinking it through, arguing it through, with post-its with driving forces on in the rooms, drawing out clusters, etc. That's what happens. That's how it's done. And these strategic conversations that take place are really where the value is seen to be. And this is the time when Bayer Crop Science, who were working with them, they were thinking of the takeover of Monsanto. So it was all thought through in this room, in fact. So this is how it works. And people have the conversations, and this goes on for 3 days maybe, overall. And so what happens in scenarios is there's an enhanced understanding of the causal processes because you're thinking through these clusters and arguing about the clusters. You've got a challenge because the methods produce 4 usually scenarios, one of which may be business as usual, the rest won't be. And the scenarios are producing the challenge and conflict in the organization rather than one person arguing with another. So it's a very good way to spark change in resistant organizations. And you can improve decision-making by aiding the evaluation of strategy. So options can be evaluated, as Paul knows and Paul has done. Options can be evaluated against the range of scenarios built using multi-attribute utility. And you can look to see whether there's a robust option that works well against a range of scenarios. You're not trying to put a probability to the scenarios. You're saying that each one is plausible, and that links to the Shackle idea, and therefore we must be ready for all the scenarios we build because we've thought them through. They're all plausible, like Labour could win the next election, Conservatives could win the next election. We've got to plan, and the things that follow on from that causally, we've got to plan for those things. And sometimes you can create a strategy that's robust against a range of scenarios on different attributes, or you can have a combination of strategies that together give you some robustness against the futures you've thought through. But obviously, nobody's a clairvoyant. These are just futures that have been thought through. Okay. Here are, this is from Futures and Foresight Science, actually. This captures really what I've been talking through. There's scoping the project, identifying the driving forces, framing the scenarios, building them as stories, which may be 2 or 3 pages long, of single-spaced A4, and then refining them, etc., over a period of time, maybe. That's the process. That's from Spaniel and Rowland in Futures and Foresight Science. They also wrote a paper which actually gave a definition of a scenario. We'll come back to this a bit later on, because it's important to know what a scenario is, perhaps. You know, it's not just one or two words, or it's not things go 10% up or things go 10% down. What is a scenario? Again, they've got a great definition that's come again from an analysis of the literature. You see, obviously it needs to be future orientated. It's about the external context, the external environment, the political, the economic, the social, the technological, etc., etc. It's not about the internal environment. That's where we create the strategies and evaluate them against the scenarios. It's a narrative description. It's a story, a causal story of how one thing leads to another. It's plausibly possible as a story. It's not seen as Martians land from outer space. You can see the Conservatives winning next election. Therefore, perhaps they're going to reduce taxation in general terms, maybe, or not increase taxation for high earners, maybe. And you can work it through. If Labour come through, what the logical things. You could actually get these bits of information maybe from the policy documents of the different things. But you can think it through as well in a different way. So it's an intuitive logic. And so they have a definition of a scenario. And we'll come back to this in a few minutes' time. Okay, here's an example of real use. This is something I was involved with in the English National Health Service in about 2012. And this is what we did. We looked for the future demand for doctors and dentists, 2012. We saw what was predetermined about the future, an aging population, I mentioned that before, an internet-savvy population as well. We're all on the internet now, working out what the best treatment is for our disease we think we may have got. We're trying to work out what the best treatment is, especially maybe if a child's involved. We're on there trying to find out. We're trying to second guess the doctors, maybe. Maybe if we can't get to see a doctor nowadays in the UK very easily. I tried to see a doctor recently. All you get to see perhaps is an intermediary, a nurse, a practitioner nurse. Difficult to get to see a doctor. So therefore, maybe you'd be even more likely to try and find out what's wrong, if it's serious or not, on the internet, especially if a child's involved. So people are more internet savvy. And we're going to work longer. You know, the pensions are no longer there. We're all working longer. You don't have to retire at 65 anymore, thank goodness. So people work on. So that's predetermined about the future, isn't it? Older population in the UK, but also most of Europe. Internet savvy older population, and a longer working life for this older population. They're predetermined about the future. That's what these medics thought, and the people from the Department of Health. Okay. So we thought about the uncertainties, and the uncertainties seem to be were the compression or expansion of morbidity up here. People are living longer, but they're iller for longer before they die. So you're living to 100, but you're ill for 20 years with the chronic diseases of old age before you die. 20 years of, problems. So that's expansion of morbidity. Compression of morbidity is we still live to 100, but maybe there's a year of illness before we drop off the perch. And these doctors and specialists thought that it was a major uncertainty, maybe linked to diet, maybe linked to social class, etc. But we know we're going to live for longer perhaps, or it's now plateauing out, but we might be iller for longer before we die, or iller for a shorter period. Also, the economy, of course, is a major thing that people think about. So you can imagine combining A1 with A2, that's compression of morbidity, and A1 with B1, and a good economy. People are living longer, but they've got a short period before they die, and the economy's in good shape. So for UK, that's not bad, is it? Not bad. But look at the last one here, A2 plus B2, plus the predetermined. We've got expansion of morbidity. People are iller for longer before they die, and the economy's in poor shape. And people are on the internet finding out what the best treatments are that they're perhaps not getting because the country can't afford it. People having to work longer, so they want to be healthy, they need to go to work. And what do you think that's like as a scenario for the UK, or for most of Europe, in fact? Not too good, is it? You can imagine social unrest, in fact, for the younger workers supporting these older people, who are all just on the internet trying to find out what's going to happen. But as the older proportion grows in size, the number of people in the older population, they'll all still be able to vote for the government that promises better healthcare. So you can imagine that's a problem as well. And what do you think was the response of UK National Health Service to this, English National Health? Well, it was a bit unclear what to do. Lots of incubation of thought, and eventually there was a lot of investment in health sciences. Because if you keep the health sciences and the patents and the expertise in the UK, at least we're not paying over the odds, for American cures and things, And that's probably all we could do. That was around 2013 that happened. Okay. That's what's going on. That's what scenarios are about. That's what they do. That's the sort of insights they give. And they are about narratives. I'm not giving you any real stories, but that's what they're about. But in parallel, in psychology, people have discovered that narrative thinking is really the key. So in parallel with these scenario activities, researchers identified the importance of narratives and underpinning causal thinking. Again, it's all in the scenarios, in how we make the sense of the world. But this has gone in parallel. And here are some Fenton O'Creevy and Tuckett. Fenton O'Creevy is based at UCL. Narratives play a central role in human responses to uncertainty and unexpected events. And as in the broader social sciences, there's been a significant narrative turn in futures and foresight research. Underpinning this narrative turn is a recognition that narrative is a primary mode of knowing. So all this goes back to Piaget, those developmental psychologists, etc. But there's a big, massive, research papers within psychology to say that narrative thinking is how people anticipate the future. Lee Beach, again in Futures and Foresight Science, again a psychologist, famous psychologist actually, and he argues narratives is the formal name for the temporal causal organization of events leading from the past to the present. The usefulness organization lies in its ability to leverage causality to extend the narrative past, how we understand the past, into the future. So that's what we're doing. And the future's events caused by present events, which themselves are caused by past events. But this gives a glimpse, he argues, into the unknowable, because it's yet to happen. If you go back to Aristotle, this causation, I've talked about causation in very simple terms, just one thing leading to another and having time precedence. He talked about what's called the efficient cause, which is the thing I've been talking about there, but also material cause, where there's a step change, e.g. a change from ice to water. Formal cause, causality would be things like legal requirements, laws, regulations, etc., that stop various things happening or allow various things to happen. So as things are pushing forward into the future, there may be formal causes that stop or restrict things happening. But the key thing about the future cause is what's called final cause. This is the focus on the motivations and likely actions of the powerful people and organizations. So this is moving away slightly from the contextual environment of social political. You're now talking about powerful actors in futures whose interests are being perhaps downgraded by what's happening in a scenario, who will use their capabilities and power to make sure they're going to be okay. Individuals, governments, countries, etc. So now you're in the world of stakeholders and stakeholder role-playing, etc. And again, this is a great way of thinking about the future. Okay. Now, there's an extra nuance to this, and Beach has brought out the idea of prime narratives, and I think it's a great, great thing. The brain organizes things into this temporal causal narrative of the past and present to extrapolate into the future in that way. But we also have what we call a prime narrative. It constitutes your store of intuitive knowledge. It's how you think about the world, your view of why people get promoted in the organization, why some people don't get promoted, why some people got on maybe. You've got your own causality about why things happen, about everything really. And it's your causality, not anybody else's perhaps. And it's what you expect to happen, and it's there. But your prime narrative, your understanding of the world, is your intuitive truth, and it will take some counter-evidence, quite a lot of it perhaps, to make you doubt it. And so causal information then it's got the causal logic, and anything that comes along it's congruent with the way you think about the world, of course, is easier to assimilate than things that aren't. So if it doesn't fit your intuitive or prime narrative, then it won't necessarily be taken on board. It'll be dismissed. So you're looking, it's like the confirmation bias. You're looking for things that confirm what you already think. It's your causality. It's your prime narrative. And when the future becomes the present, of course, these things that happen have to be incorporated in your prime narrative. And your prime narrative may change to accommodate it, but he argues that it's going to be reluctantly. So we've got our own view of the world, and we don't change it that often, perhaps. We hear things, we see things, confirmation bias, etc., etc. So the whole idea of heuristics and biases can be looked at through this new lens, I think, of the prime narrative. And of course, in a scenario exercise where you're in a group, I just said that's the one I just said, isn't it? It's this one. So if you're in a group building scenarios like the biocrop science about the future, et cetera, you've got your own prime narrative about how the world's working, how things fit together, and you're participating with others who've got different viewpoints, different causalities, and you're accommodating them as best you can, or maybe like that. And eventually you come together with 4 scenarios, perhaps 3 of them you don't believe as much as the one you put the most effort into, perhaps. It's got more of your causality in. But the key then is this idea of causality, and if the group scenario method or scenarios differ very much from your own prime narrative, you will tend to dismiss those. That's the logic from Beecher's theory. So all this has implications, actually, as we'll talk about in a few minutes' time. So scenario practice then, it's about agreement on 4 plausible futures. The decision makers are best involved with the development of the scenarios rather than being received. Because if you've got your prime narratives and somebody else in the organization has developed the scenarios and it doesn't match with your prime narrative, if you're the senior decision maker, you're not going to take it on board. So therefore, get the senior decision makers involved with the scenarios, as we tend to do, so that the decision makers, it's their scenarios and they will take decisions based on the scenarios, rather than having a received scenario that doesn't, people don't believe because it doesn't engage with, or there's been no engagement process perhaps with the prime narrative. So it's all very qualitative. It's a strong emphasis, though, on causality, these methods, and we can evaluate options using multi-attribute value analysis. Okay, in forecasting practice, what happens? Well, if you look at National Grid's future energy scenarios for 2017, and I was involved in making some evaluation of this for SSE because they had to make their own scenarios because they were forced by National Grid, in fact, to build scenarios for Scotland. It was interesting to look at what they did. And they built some scenarios, and it's similar. It seems on the surface to be very similar to what the people the people do in these workshops I showed you. And it's got political in there, economic, social, technological, etc. So it looks about right, but there is no storyline, there is no causality. It's just events really. And they've got several scenarios in there, or 4 scenarios. One is when there's a lot of prosperity in the country, UK, and one is there's a lot of prosperity in the country and a lot of focus on green ambition. So you've got a lot of money, you've got a green focus. You can imagine there's a lot of sale of heat pumps and electric cars. If there's not much money in the country and you've got a focus on green ambition, then you're down here and it's slow, everything's slow. If you've got no focus on green and you've got a lot of money, then of course you've got consumer power and you're just buying things, you're not so concerned about green. So you can imagine, but it was built, and I tried to find the detail of it, it wasn't built in a very structured causal way though. But you can do it, and they've done it, and they then make forecasts on the basis of this. So here are things like electric car take-up, heat pumps, windmills, etc., and within each of the scenarios. So it's almost like trend impact analysis, if you remember that from years gone by, where events could happen, would impact a trend. Here, scenarios could happen, would impact a trend, say the trend for heat pumps, the trend for electric cars, the trend for electricity storage, etc. And that's what they've done. So I think it's almost like, it's a version of trend impact analysis. But it's not real scenarios. And these are received scenarios, etc., etc. It's not been developed. But it's one way of doing it. It's almost a bit like a sensitivity analysis, I suppose. In the judgmental forecasting laboratory, interesting to see what's going on there. And there has been a lot of work recently, but of necessity, it's been fairly simplified in terms of the scenarios that have been used. Let me just show you a few things that have been done. First, on subjective probability assessment, linking to the super forecasters, interesting to see what they've done with scenarios, because they've done a bit with it. And then we'll talk about scenarios, as I say, as a forecasting context. So subjective probability assessment, coming back to the early one then, here's a diagram, I think, from Paul and I's book, actually. This one, is it, Paul? I think it was. Where, if you've made repetitive forecasts and you've received timely feedback, you're able to assess a probability because it's a repetitive situation. If you've made repetitive forecasts, not made repetitive forecasts, and there is a reference class, like a base rate, you could use that to make the forecast. But mostly, especially with geopolitical events, there's no repetitive forecast, there's no reference class really, and therefore we're in the domain of potential heuristics and biases. And of course, the super forecasters are all in that area. They're not like weather forecasters, for instance. And here's what they've done. So they focused on training subjective probability judgments for focus on geopolitical events, but the training's never been for more than 1 hour. And it's included in that our probability sum rule, because they're all being probability forecasts, exploring and challenging assumptions, again, a bit unclear what it was, identifying key causal drivers, and identification of worst and best case scenario. And all that's done in an hour somehow. Exactly what happened, I've no idea, really. I'm sure something sensible happened, but we need to really decompose that. But the scenarios, as I know them, and as you know them from the beginning of my talk, that wouldn't be in there. And they argued that it was those scenario training, but not as I know it. Second follow-up paper on this was linked to this, where there was teaming, and groups were getting together. The probability training was more effective than scenario training, the argument was. But the scenario training was, difficult to know what it was really. Allowed communication between participants to motivate another, share news and exchange rationales. Remember, exchanging rationales is very much like the Delphi process, but here it would be unstructured, and it would be unclear about whether people could change their minds anonymously, not loose face, etc. So again, lots going on here, but we're not quite clear what was going on in terms of training. And there's the focus on probability versus scenarios. And maybe if you've got Bria score as an output, then maybe you're measuring something where the distribution of probability, the change in that could actually impact the Bria score. But therefore, I mentioned this yesterday, decompose the Bria score to see where the impact really is. So lots going on there. We need to know more. Scenarios of forecasting contacts then. We've done a lot of research, very recent, last few years. Here's one paper looking at tourism experts and stakeholders, judgments for 3 alternative scenarios: pessimistic, most likely, and optimistic. So that was the scenarios. Just actually the term was the scenario: pessimistic, optimistic, most likely. And people, on the basis of this, they made some forecasted levels, lower 10 to 30% on international rivals, etc. Given it was an optimistic scenario, which is, but again, just defined by those words. Here's another one then by Dillek. Again, this is seminal research, really, early research. But again, I'm saying perhaps it can be broadened a bit from now on in. So this is time series adjustments, 1 period point ahead, and the scenarios were things like: this is the best performing mobile phone with complex features. It was a hit product first introduced with new features added, price reasonably positioned, desirable object, teenager consumer group, future looks bright, expected to carry forward. So that's a best case scenario. You can imagine receiving that before making an adjustment to the time series, or maybe the best case and the worst case, or the worst case and the best case. You can manipulate all that to see what impact it has on the adjustments made. And you can imagine the impacts are quite strong, really. You can imagine with this sort of scenario. But remember, it's not a scenario utilizing the Pestel dimensions. It's not utilizing causality. It's a very, very much a snapshot. Another one, Paul here, in this one, pessimistic and optimistic scenarios. Product K, a mobile phone, stable demand, combination of necessary features, nicely designed, fairly positioned, good feedback from customers. There may be a slightly higher demand. And you can imagine pessimistic, optimistic, or what comes first, which one you'll just get one before you make the adjustment, would have a impact, et cetera, et cetera. You can imagine the same would happen in the National Grid case I just went through as well. And here's another one. Product A is expanding a loyal user base, improved, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it's focused very much on a snapshot rather than this very much more detailed in practice approach to causality and telling a narrative, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, these scenarios are received scenarios anyway. They're not necessarily going to jar with the prime narrative of the person, because they're not really, so, they would be seen, it'd be more of a framing effect. I think this is the way I view this, as on adjustments made. And here's one that goes a bit more into forecasting context, actually. This was, again, I think, with Dillek and also Ian Belton, who worked with recently. So this is imagining a Turkish government decides to ban all Syrian refugees from entering Turkey. Using scenario generation technique that you've been taught, we'd like you to think about the scenarios, as many as you can, that might occur as a consequence of this policy decision that may happen by the Turkish government. And the scenario generation technique was, again, not a fully formed one, in my view. It was, write down as many thoughts as you can without self-censoring. A mind map may be useful. And interesting, in this situation, the Turkish government did ban Syrian refugees, And there was a free-form possibility of people making forecasts within the scenario generation task, and the ones that were made were evaluated in terms of outcomes. So it's moving towards maybe what can happen there. And there's another one as well by Sherry. Again, you know, sort of imagine you're coming home after a busy day, a water pipe's broken, you call the plumber, and you can imagine this catastrophe is going to have some impact on your forecast of savings and expenses over the next periods, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I think it's more of a framing study than a true scenario study. Okay, so from all this then, issues and concerns emerge, I think. This idea of causality is really key in scenarios, and not captured so much either in the practice-based applications linked to forecasting and national grid, not captured in so much in the forecasting laboratory. The idea of prime narratives is a long way from being captured, where things have to mix with your prime narrative, how you think about the world, how that needs to be captured first before you can do this sort of study. The scenarios tend to be received, they're given to you, rather than being self-developed. You can imagine in forecasting practice, I mentioned, it's people who develop the scenarios, especially the senior types, etc. The Pestel is not used really, but it's not the real contextual environment that's being talked about in the scenarios in the laboratory, or it is in the forecasting practice, but it's not got the causal links and the systems implications, etc. They tend to be short form in the laboratory, of course they do, to make it easy to use, etc. But in the real world, then these scenarios tend to be maybe 3 or 4 pages long, for instance. And this focus on narrative causality is really what it's about. And it's, as I say, from the psychology, this is how people think. It's how people think about the past, how we got to the present, and how we think about the future. So unless we engage with that narrative causality, and also engage with the prime narratives, we're not really utilizing scenarios in a strong way. But of course, the world of practice of by scenario practitioners, like Kees van der Heijden I mentioned earlier, is a world of case studies rather than laboratory situations. And that's, of course, the problem in many ways. So what we've got then are a range, lots of things happening simultaneously. We've got subjective probability assessments, little focus on narratives maybe, or narrative assessments. We've got judgmental adjustments to time series, and maybe little focus on the narratives or the rationale so much. We've got this focus on Delphi, which focuses very much on narratives, in some forms of the Delphi, where you listen to other people's explanations, but it's relatively unstructured how you elicit the narratives. They're just free-form reasons for why people think why they think. And then you've got this really big emphasis on causality and contextual environment and interaction, etc., but facilitated in the real world context. So that's where we are. I'm not sure where it all leads, but that's really my encapsulation, I think, of what the issues are and the concerns that emerge from that. So thank you very much indeed.
Well, we've got quite some time for questions. Anybody got any questions they'd like to ask George then?
Thank you, George. That's great. When you're reviewing the methods in judgmental forecasting, you emphasize a lot on Delphi. You didn't. Sorry, when you are reviewing the methods on judgmental forecasting, yes, you emphasized a lot on Delphi method.
Delphi, yeah.
You didn't say much about interaction groups, which, at least in some of my studies, we found very promising results.
Yeah. Well, Delphi method is a group method, but the interaction is structured rather than free form. So there's nominal group technique, et cetera, et cetera. But the evidence that's been presented and reviewed by Jean, myself, and Fergus as well, show that the Delphi method can improve over unstructured interacting groups in terms of forecast accuracy in the short term. That's the way it's been used. So Delphi tends to work, I think, well, because in an interacting group, if you change your mind, it's obvious to others you've changed your mind and you can lose face, etc. But if you can do it anonymously, so in Delphi you make an assessment of something, you hear what everybody else says and why, you then can change your assessment and nobody knows you've changed it, but the system, the Delphi computer systems show you what the result is, and that result is more accurate than the average of the initial opinions. So I think the interacting groups, and that's what happens in a scenario exercise. It's just an interacting group, people just talking free form, and it's not in structure. So maybe there's a rationale perhaps for structuring perhaps a scenario exercise to make it more, people make assessments maybe of, impact and predictability using Delphi, which I've actually done, but in more of a long-term thing. But good question.
By the way, can you hear George speaking? I'm not sure you've got the microphone on. Can you hear him at the back?
Yes, I've got my microphone as well.
Yeah. Any other questions for George then? Right.
Robert.
I forecast you can ask him a question. It's a good judgmental forecast, yeah.
It's not going to be a difficult one, is it, Robert? I hope not.
And George can forecast the question.
Yes, well, the answer is no.
I can forecast the answer, but other people don't know. George, if you... well, let me ask very simply. What's the relationship between a good scenario and a bad scenario and an outcome?
And an outcome. Well,
it could be a complex outcome,
yeah.
Of course.
What I've just done, I've got some extra slides on this. I could have gone through them, but I didn't. We just did a review of all the scenarios that were built by many organisations after COVID occurred. And there's 216 scenario sets. And we've been through all of them to make some evaluation of the quality of the process and all the quality of the content. But I said I didn't have time to talk about it here. So I think you can measure both the quality of the process. Remember, my process is quite detailed, but there are other processes as well. The content you can measure in terms of things like, whether the full pastel influences have been used, etc. But the outcome is very much about an intuitive change in the minds of the decision makers. That's why these senior types pay for this process, because there is no outcome measure of whether the scenario, improved maybe decisions, because obviously in a firm over a longitudinal setting you can never really show that. So what happens is people come in with their intuitions about the best decision to make maybe, or what's going to happen, and then they go through this process and they think at a higher level. Their intuitions change, and that's why people value the process. It's attitudinal. There's no more to it than that. It's almost, if you look at the valuation of decision analysis, again, it's an attitudinal thing, because you can't measure only with forecasting, really, have you got the outcome data. And remember, because scenarios are long-term as well, it's quite difficult. There have been some studies of the outcome verification in Delphi with long-term forecasts. A guy called Parente did this. He had 25-year-ahead forecasts with Delphi. He then waited the 25 years, and then tried to see what happened. But he found that all the statements that he got people to make forecasts about were not very intelligible. He couldn't pin it down. So it was something like, it would be something like improvements in air travel or something like that. But it was kind of unclear what it was, and so he couldn't do the outcome data. So outcomes are really not part of it. And that's a problem, of course. And even with the National Grid one I showed you, you can imagine it's more like a sensitivity analysis, isn't it? So you're saying if that scenario happens, more heat pumps will be installed, or more electric cars will be on the roads. If that scenario happens, there'll be less. But of course, the scenarios themselves have an infinitesimal likelihood of occurrence, because the intersection of events will never probably occur. So what you've got is just 4 very different scenarios, each equally plausible, but without a probability attached. And just like in trend impact analysis, like if an event happens, will it affect the trend and how much, etc. It's very difficult to generate the database really to do outcome evaluation, because it's probabilistic, the event happening to start with, etc., etc. So I've not found a lot of it. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, Robert. Am I? Or... Sort of.
I just think that it's possible to make more progress. Why is it desirable to make more progress? I think we'd all like it to be more substantiated than senior executives like it. I am in no sense doubt it, and as you know, I've developed my own scenarios over the years. So yeah, senior executives like high level of plausibility. So it's up to the researchers. So, for example, you gave for example, has led to more spending on the national health. And,
Life sciences research.
so you can certainly identify when some of the conditional events or trends have taken place. So you can do partial evaluations. So I think, and I'm a scenario researcher, but I do think it would be beneficial if scenario research spent more energy on that issue of validation rather than actually say. So as you know, looking at Shell's history during the period they became famous for scenarios, they actually performed worse than the alternative oil companies. Now, that's just one example, but nevertheless it does show that there are ways of looking at the impact of scenario planning adoption.
I think the one way to do it, maybe, I say I don't think you can do so much with the scenarios, it's look about as a decision-making process. And if you can create options that work well against the scenarios, and that's, you measure the effectiveness of the options over the long term, and where you've invested, etc., that would allow you perhaps to see whether a firm that goes for this robust approach to a range of different futures is better off in the long run than an organisation that doesn't do that. But that's the only way I think it could be done. I don't know.
Okay, time for another question. Fergus?
Thanks for the overview, George. I just wondered what your best case scenario is for the research and practice in the future with scenarios and these sorts of technologies.
Research and practice in scenarios. Well, I think a lot's going on, but it comes from a practitioner base, see? You've got these people like David Tuckett, writing about different ways of making decisions that are not based on subjective expected utility. You've got James Derbyshire looking at Shackle's axiom base and applying that to this intuitive logics method. You've got a range of Lee Beach linking it to the psychology. So there's a lot of activity, but it's not activity perhaps, it's not outcome-based activity. That's the problem with this. And most of the research, I think, in the end will be attitudinal, and it will show that, doing certain things with scenarios opens up more possibilities. People think about more things, etc. They're less confident about the future, etc. Like they were trying to do with the super forecasters approach. But of course, in the super forecasters approach, they weren't using scenarios, I don't think, very much at all, really. It was a bit unclear what they were using. So I don't know, I think there's a long way to go. But the intersection of all this, remember, if it's true, and I think it is, that people anticipate the future using these causal narratives, especially the prime narrative, then if we can make more use of that in what we do, in forecasting perhaps, then we've got something. That's why people intervene with their changes, because they know something, they think they know something, that they should make a change to a time series maybe. They have this causality, and that's really what it's all about. So, somehow we have to make the best use of the causality to elicit it in a better way, to sort of challenge it, to et cetera, et cetera. That's probably really where the action is in terms of improving causal thinking within all these range of anticipation methods.
Yeah, there's time for another question. So thanks, George, for a very nice talk. When you had this energy example, that's just that triggered me, and you tell me what you think about this point. When there's a jury in court, these people get isolated to be sure they're not influenced, right, by the external environment. Yeah. And I think this energy example is very interesting because in terms of scenario thinking, with energy, there's a lot of lobbying, stuff happening in the media. So how do we make sure, in terms of group-based scenario thinking, that we dampen all these external effects?
Well, I think one of the issues is, of course, in normal forecasting, we don't think so much about having scenarios. People just come into an exercise, judgmental forecasting, and make a forecast. But of course, everything they've been reading in the media recently possibly influences the judgmental forecast they made, unless you're in a framing sort of situation where you're giving them sets of things to think about. So therefore, perhaps we should structure information in a way that gives a full range of opinions, perhaps, before a person makes an assessment, and make sure they don't come in having just heard the latest news about Nadine Dorries and the Conservative government, or and that's not what they're influencing their instant forecast, where we don't ask for a rationale, and by not asking for a rationale, we don't know what the influence was, and it might be something recent and media influenced, etc., etc. We've got no idea about that. In the Delphi process, of course you do, because you get the comments back about why people made the forecast they did, and you as a forecaster, listening to what other people have said, you can disregard them and not change your own forecast, or change it if you think they've said something that's very sensible, et cetera, et cetera. So all this area, this causality, the prime narratives, et cetera, I think is really fundamental to forecasting and anticipation. Okay.
Okay, we've still got about 2 minutes more. Could you?
Fundamentally, is it at the end when somebody makes a forecast that the uncertainty of the forecast increases appropriately? Can I put it this way?
So when somebody makes a forecast,
So I have 4, 5, 7 scenarios, right?
Yeah.
And none of them could be true at the end, okay?
That's all
But
true,
still,
yeah.
when making forecast now, the uncertainty the forecast they're making would appropriately be higher because I'm incorporating those.
Yeah, I think if you listen to a range of scenarios, and they're all plausible, not Martians land from outer space, but they each had a good logic within them, that would perhaps make you less confident in the forecast you're making. It would make your forecast range be larger. And again, this is possible to do this in the experimental laboratory to test out these things. But all this has yet be fully developed. All the stuff I talked about in the laboratory, the forecasting laboratory, is all very recent, and it's all because of that. It's obviously used simplifications, but knowledge is coming forward about what the next step is. I think that's the way I view it in all this.
Okay, anyway. I think we better bring it to a close. So I'd like to thank George for a very interesting talk and a response.
Thank you. Thank you.